I'm going to talk about a particular koan today, and it was handed out by Al. I purposely isolated the first section of the koan. I'll talk a little bit about it as we go along. I just have to get these pages out of the way and find my page. Okay, here's my page. It's as we were saying earlier, the vicissitudes of being online. You know, you have everybody on a flat surface, and you would like to see them, but and you want to see your material too, which I don't print out. I keep it on the side of the screen, and you know, various windows jump in the way. It's like reality over only flatter. So here's the koan that that I was thinking about, in which I based this talk on. It's from the Mumonkan Case 13. Shan Holds His Bowl, and it's part one of the koan because part two gets very esoteric and goes into a whole bunch of different secret manipulations that the various Zen masters are doing to trick each other and you know, awaken their students by surprising them. But and that's a lot of times what people talk about in the koan. What was going on? What were they talking about? What did they do? But I'm really interested in this first part, and I think it's very simple, and at the same time, I really, really like it. So here it is. TeShan went to the dining room from the meditation hall, holding his bowl. Shui Feng was on duty cooking. When he met TeShan, he said, "The dinner drum is not yet beaten. Where are you going with your bowl?" TeShan turned around and went back to his room. And that's the entire initial story. So I have a couple of paragraphs here from a talk that was given by Roshi Norman Fisher that goes into a little bit more detail about the koan. I wanted to read that because it just sort of fills in the scenario of the context of the koan. So Shui Feng is well known to have been an expert tenso chef. He is thorough, serious, energetic, dedicated, probably picky about details. So he was always asked to be tenso. It's said that he always traveled with his own knife and rice bucket, figuring he'd need them at the next monastery. Anyway, he's tenso, and the abbot, TeShan, probably walks through the kitchen to get to the refectory. TeShan is a little spaced out that day, and I'll add that he was aging, and he was an older master at that point. And he comes in early for the meal carrying his bowl. This would have been an embarrassment. Ordinarily, a monk like Shui Feng would be very apologetic here, saying to the master, "Oh, sorry, sir, but the meal isn't ready yet." Some accounts, I'll skip one line, not important. So, you know, in a sense, even though it was TeShan's mistake, as tenzo and as one of the monks, you would be the one to apologize. And that's really all of the description that I wanted to read. I wanted to bring to life a little bit this idea of this very serious, you know, very precise, stern cook telling the master, "Hey man, you made a mistake. You came at the wrong time. What are you doing?" And giving him a hard time about it instead of being sympathetic or apologetic. So not only is there the embarrassment of TeShan, the master, making a little bit of a foolish mistake, and perhaps also one of inattention, showing his age perhaps, and being not quite with it, as is implied by the koan, but he's also treated in a way that would be considered disrespectful by a cook who's a little bit arrogant, the monk who's a little bit arrogant, who's in charge of the meals, pointing out his error rather brusquely. "Where are you going with your bowl, man? You know, you don't say that to the master." And criticizing him rather than being sympathetic and kind or acknowledging his status as the master. And there's part of the analysis of the koan is about, the cook's attitude and how he gets a little bit of a lesson along with the other monks in the monastery, but I'm not too interested in that. I'm really much more interested in TeShan. I think it's pretty amazing that they even have stories like this from ancient China, which so much implicate the psychology of the people involved and the interrelations of different types of relationships, and status and breaking status, as well as issues of ego. And I'm going to say a little bit more about TeShan's response, but first I'll tell a little story that happened to me back in prehistoric times when I was in kindergarten. And yes, when I was young, they already had kindergarten and other grades, and they had schoolhouses and things. Of course, I had to walk to school or take my horse. No, I'm just kidding. So when I was in kindergarten, I had a humiliating event take place, and it still sticks with me until today, except that now I look at it a little bit differently. The teacher, whose name I remember too, like the baseball player, Mrs. Stottlemyre, there's a baseball player who's very famous, Mel Stottlemyre, from like 20, 30 years ago. So Mrs. Stottlemyre was calling us up to get cookies and milk for the afternoon snack. So she would call the roll, and each child, as they were called, would go up to get their milk and cookies. As usual, I was looking at a book of some kind and not paying attention. So when I heard my name called, I automatically raised my hand and said, "Here," as if she was taking attendance, making it very clear that I didn't know where I was or what time it was. So the whole class burst into laughter. And, if they had laughed for a minute, it would have been okay, but they kept laughing for what seemed like, 4 or 5 minutes. They thought it was hilarious that I had made this mistake. So finally, I had a burst of temper and I yelled out in a loud voice. And I always had a very strong voice. So I yelled out, "Shut up," which is, especially back then, if a kid said something like that, it was pretty bad. So everybody stopped. There was complete silence in the room. And Mrs. Stottlemyre walked me out to the hall for a lecture on how I shouldn't behave that way. It was my fault. So I always thought it was extremely unjust because the kids had been laughing at me, and she didn't criticize them. She didn't tell them to stop laughing or say something nice to me. Speaking of TeShan and his treatment by the cook. But I apparently was not allowed to defend myself either. I couldn't tell them to stop. So I was left feeling not only embarrassed, but also a sense of having been unjustly criticized for, taking the situation into my own hands. So I thought I handled it pretty well. So stop laughing at me. So, but now, thinking about this koan and also thinking back on the event, and I can remember it very clearly, even though it was really a long time ago, because certain things just stick in your mind. And it's possible, I think to myself, something that would have truly not been possible for me back then, which is to have felt the vulnerability of making a mistake and enjoyed the laughter. And I'm not saying this in a way to say that it's okay for kids to humiliate other kids or to laugh at them or to make them feel bad or anything like that. But from my point of view, as a practitioner, it interests me for myself at how I could have looked at it. And when I hear their laughter now in my mind and I go back and reinspect it, I realized that it actually wasn't mean laughter. They actually weren't putting me down. It was kind of a relief from the normal course of affairs and a moment of levity. It was a release for them. They were laughing kind of happily. They weren't like, "Ah, you're so stupid." But my child self, of course, didn't see it that way. But it made me think, oh, with my Zen practice, maybe I could see it that way. If something happened where I made a mistake and somebody thought it was funny, maybe I could not take it personally. So TeShan, as the master, definitely would have been justified in calling out the chef and criticizing his somewhat arrogant response, and sort of taking the high ground and putting the master down. Where are you going with your bowl? Nobody even beat the dinner drum yet. I mean, come on. Normally, anyone who saw the master make a mistake would ignore it or gently correct him. Instead, Shui Feng took a superior position and criticized him, and the master would have been justified in rebuking him. He could have acted like the master and, hit him with a stick or said, "How dare you criticize me? Who are you? Do you think you understand the practice better than me?" Or he could have even made believe he had come down early to test Shui Feng and say, I thought you wouldn't be so reactive, but now I see you're not ready yet. You're still reacting to things and attached to everything being on time. But TeShan didn't have any strategies. He didn't do anything to try to make it better for himself. He didn't try to criticize the monk, the chef. All he did was accord with the situation. He bowed and went back to his room. And so on one level, that's just a complete perfect action, according with the situation. And I really like it on that level. Just not adding anything, not taking anything away, just accord with the situation. Not time yet, go back. But on another level, it raises the question of personal psychology and the nature of the ego. And again, nothing that I'm going to say is meant to say that it's okay for people to behave badly. But as Zen practitioners, no matter what we do in the world to correct an unjust situation, we still have to deal with our internal reactions and how we take things in and whether we internalize them and suffer from them. As Roshi said, I don't know if everybody caught this or not, but Roshi said at one point when we were sitting at the retreat a couple of months ago, he said, if you really look into it, it might turn out that your entire story of suffering took place only in the mind. And I've been thinking about that since I heard that. So to me, the significant part of the story, or the part that I am drawn to focus on, is that TeShan, after being in an embarrassing situation, he didn't do anything to try to make it less embarrassing or criticize someone else or rationalize why he was down there early. He took the feeling of having made the mistake and the embarrassment that was in that situation, and he left it open and brought it back with him. And he was not afraid to dwell in the place of making a mistake and even being embarrassed. So he shows a kind of mastery that's a little bit different than we sometimes see in the Zen stories, where the masters will do the perfect thing at the perfect time. They'll say the perfect enlightening phrase. They'll take an action that just astounds everyone at the exact right moment. How could the master be that spontaneously brilliant? In this case, he didn't do the right thing. He didn't take the right action at the right time, and he just accepts it. Like, yeah, I made a mistake. And I think that his ability to not be reactive in that situation and to just keep that energy open shows, in a way, an even deeper mastery of himself, and a mastery of going with what happens in life without trying to, do something with it. So it leads me to inquire how many of us and to what extent are we able to have the sense of openness and confidence in being part of the flow of whatever happens, that we can tolerate our own embarrassment or error and stay with it and sort of appreciate or allow that feeling instead of trying to make it go away. In a sense, it's saying, I admit I'm not perfect. I admit I'm human. I admit I'm not in control, that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to even to feel embarrassed if you do. And in addition, because of that, he took the perfect action in accord with the situation. Come early, go back to the room. And you can see how that pattern, if you were to graph it out, of coming, being stopped, turning around, and going back, it's like a perfect arc in and a perfect arc out. And you can see how an egoic response would have caused, ripples in the pattern, all kinds of turbulence. If he had criticized the cook or justified himself or insisted that he was there at the right time or whatever and gotten into some kind of conflict, instead he just went with it and didn't cause any additional unrest and negativity. And there's a kind of harmony there, or harmonious action, that's kind of like the Tao and Taoism. And the Tao is sometimes referred to among the Chinese Zen masters, just being harmonious and being in accord with whatever happens. My feeling is that if in Zen practice, when we're sitting with ourselves, we allow all the squishy feelings to come up and breathe through them, all the different things that we feel about ourselves, that we feel about past events, that we feel about life, and allow those feelings to get processed through our breathing and our sitting. Times that we have felt impatient, frustrated, humiliated, lonely, not worthy, whatever it may be, embarrassed. Then we can wind up using our practice to be in a much different space when these come up in life. And TeShan, I think, demonstrated that he had a kind of psychological openness that came from his practice. So what about us? To what extent can we be present with embarrassing or other uncomfortable feelings and breathe with it and be with it and feel okay about having these different sides to our emotional spectrum? What makes us feel too vulnerable to just sit with that energy, and what kinds of circumstances make us feel like we have to respond in a way that will erase that feeling? So just like I've been learning recently to enjoy, I've always liked the feeling of working on koans, but recently I realized that when I can't get a koan, and I was recently stuck on one for several weeks, and that feeling of doubt and not knowing what the answer is and not knowing if you're going to get it or not, like we often feel in life, we don't know how things are going to work out. I started enjoying that feeling of doubt. They talk about cultivating great doubt, and I started really seeing like, oh, I don't know the answer, so this is a great opportunity for me to sit with the doubt and really cultivate that feeling of not knowing. And it takes a very unpleasant feeling because you want to get the answer. The ego wants to get the answer. It turns that unpleasant feeling into actually a pleasant feeling of like, wow, this not knowing actually is different and it feels good and it has its own energy to it. So I wonder to what extent we can do that with other parts of our emotional spectrum that we might not be inclined to want to experience, and what kind of fruits we might be able to get out of those feelings. Even though it's a little easier for me to sit with uncomfortable emotional energies than it was years ago, and I've had a few different practices, a few different therapies along the way, but it's still difficult for me to just be myself. Among others, in particular, I'm kind of okay with myself, but not trying to be perfect, not trying to manage my self-presentation, but just feel that sense of vulnerability and openness and not knowing how things are going to go, and not try to put some kind of a persona over that. As we all, make mistakes and then either get blamed for them or blame ourselves. And, how do you relate to that situation is, to me, it's a very big part of practice, because when everybody's happy and things are going well, great. I'm super enlightened today because everything is wonderful. When I first came to the group in the first retreat, and I wasn't quite sure, how they did kinhin, watching everyone and trying to walk in the right direction, stop at the right time and bow at the right time. And so these issues come up, and the question is, you could be someone who's just like, yeah, I'm doing the best I can. I'm going to get it, and I'll get it when I get it. And it's not, sure, I may not do it perfectly right now, but it's not like, oh, a horrible mistake. But at the same time, it's interesting to me as part of practice, when you do have those moments where you seem like you're not quite with it, and everybody seems to know what they're doing, but you don't. Like you were saying, how do you interact with that? And in this particular koan, Shui Feng made it worse by playing the part of the perfectionist part of the ego and saying, hey man, we have not yet beaten the dinner drum. What are you doing here? And making it a mistake. So what I like about TeShan or Tokusan's in Japanese reaction is that he doesn't take the bait. He doesn't have a need to go to that level of ego justification and play with him there. He just lets it go. And there's nothing to fight about. Come, go. And like you said, the second arrow is just the second arrow whizzes right by him and can't strike him. I also don't want to be perfectionist about that. I'm so embarrassed about being hit by the arrow. I do that too. Why am I having these feelings? I've been practicing for such a long time. I shouldn't have these feelings. Yeah. In my day job, which takes place at night most of the time, I'm an acting teacher. And what you just brought up is really interesting, because doing dramaturgy, looking back to the circumstances behind the text, what was the place and time of the play and what was going on at the time, if you were doing a classical piece or something like that. But also, if you look at the text and you have to interpret the circumstances, you have to know what circumstances you are saying something in and what the meaning of it is. So that's interesting how you would determine what the context was and what the Shui Feng was really up to. Is that, even if we've already done the koan and we're not looking for the right answer anymore, which is kind of nice to go back to the koan and just be able to be with it, not have an intention behind it except to explore it, that we can still use our koan technique of embodying the koan. Yeah. And it's a lot of fun to throw yourself into that situation, which is why I read the little quote about the two personalities from Norman Fisher. Throw yourself back there and what it might have been like to be there, with this situation and how you would react to it. So yeah, that's cool. And you could take turns being Shui Feng and being TeShan. Really enjoying the responses to the koan and the different ways of exploring it and looking at it. Although the koan is so simple in a certain way, it's a very short interaction with a coming and a going. It's to me, it's so deep. There's just a lot to it, and I really like being with this koan. Going back to it, having done it in the past, but going back to it and just taking the part that I want to look at and just hanging out with it. We still have a few more minutes if anybody wants to make a comment or raise a query or a thought about any aspect of it. And don't feel that you have to rush, because I like the idea of having a little bit of conversation, and then maybe, if we're sitting for another minute or two to see if anybody has a thought or has anything to say, we can sit and wait a little bit too. We don't have to constantly be moving forward. And don't worry, I won't keep us hanging too long. Well, if no one has an additional comment, and if you do jump in, then we may actually wind up close to the hour for this session, and be able to end the session with all of our assorted cats. Thank you so much for the really thoughtful and interesting comments and explorations of the koan. I really like to, in a certain way, having a small group. It's not tiny, which is nice, but it's not gigantic either. And so it's a little more intimate, and people can have a chance to really, you know, explore a little bit more. And you know, not, and it might be nice for some people not to have 20 or 30 people listening to them too, you know, be in a slightly tighter configuration with just a few people. Anyway, I really enjoyed it. I love this time slot, and I'm glad to have the chance to teach a little bit more. And I really thank you all for your presence and your participation. That's really great.